we can, and in some sense must, design a completely different infrastructure for how human beings coordinate and operate.
Hey, what's up, Coordination? This episode is with Jordan Hall, who is a serial entrepreneur, the founder of DivX, worked at mp3.com, has been in technology for 30 years. He's someone who I deeply admire and respect. I discovered him on podcasts talking about this thing called Game B, which is basically paying down systemic risk for humanity, trying to find a new way to relate to each other that is more harmonious and more focused on sovereignty. He's been a serial entrepreneur who has played the game for several decades and learned a lot. And that has led to a lot of deeply embodied, grounded insights about coordination and how Web3 can be a massive lever for creating more coordination in the world, paying down systemic risk, supporting public goods, creating a better world. Jordan and I talk a lot in this episode about Game B, but we also talk about traversing the design space of Web3 with consciousness and intention. What is the superpower that's going to allow us to view the game board from above and to more effectively launch projects that are effective in creating more coordination for the world? This episode is like rich chocolate cake. Once you bite into it, I think that you're going to need to digest it a little bit. I'm going to spend a couple recordings of re-watching this episode in order to fully grasp what Jordan is saying and the intention behind it. I think that it's a deeply impactful episode for our audience who are trying to use Web3 to create more regenerative cryptoeconomic systems. So thanks so much for tuning in. Coordination, I give you Jordan Hall.
Bankless is proud to be sponsored by Uniswap. Uniswap is a new paradigm in asset exchange infrastructure. Instead of a cumbersome order book system where trades are matched with other humans, Uniswap is an autonomous piece of software on Ethereum that lets you trade any token at the current market price. No human counterparties or centralized intermediaries, just autonomous code on Ethereum. Input the token you want to sell and receive the token you want to buy. The Uniswap Grants program is accepting applications for grants. Do you have something of value that you think you want to contribute to the Uniswap ecosystem? No matter how big or small your idea is, you can apply for a unique grant at uniswapgrants.org and help steer Uniswap in the direction that you think it should go. Thank you, Uniswap, for sponsoring Bankless.
So, you've got some money, but how are you going to use it? You want to spend.
You, me, shopping, now, bro.
When you know you should be saving.
You'll never buy a house at this rate.
But what if you could spend and save at the same time? For the enlightened kind, with inquiring minds, a new world awaits. Set yourself free with completely flexible, self-repaying loan technology. Supported on desktop and mobile, seize the power of Alchemix, allowing you to spend and save at the same time. Leverage your wealth without risk of liquidation. Take out a loan that repays itself. By using yield from your deposit to pay off your balance, your only debt is time. What was once inconceivable is now within your grasp.
You're winning, son.
Hey, everyone. I'm here with Jordan Hall, who is a serial entrepreneur and is here to talk with us today about Game B. Welcome, Jordan.
Hi, nice to see you.
So great to have you, and thanks for agreeing to do this episode with me. So I'd be curious, just to start off, you're a serial entrepreneur, you were at mp3.com, founded DivX. How did you get into crypto?
When I exited DivX in 2007, one of the things, two things that were happening sort of more or less simultaneously. One was I was really reflecting on the experience of what it was like to start a tech company with a very specific social-oriented intent, and the particulars of how participation in capitalism, venture capitalism, and in particular going public, impacted the ability, for example, for the relationship with the community and the way that the kind of thing that we were trying to do evolved. So I was really contemplating what is this thing, and particularly I was contemplating this thing, money. Like, how does money work? Let's call it as maybe a medium in the larger social environment.
Right.
And of course, the financial crisis was beginning to unfold as well. So I happened to be, on my own basis, noticing that we needed to think of a different way to allocate resources to productive activity than IPOs and venture capital. And the financial crisis was making the question of money quite pointed. So I was doing a deep dive, and you probably are aware of this. It's become, I think, relatively common knowledge. But the official scholarship on money, at least back then in particular, was quite poor. Like the thinking economic profession, such as it is, on money was thin gruel. So I just began to sort of expand outward, reading and thinking about all kinds of things. And I came across the white paper. I think I actually encountered the white paper before the actual first blocks were produced.
Sure. Are we talking about the Bitcoin white paper?
Yes, the Bitcoin white paper.
Okay, cool.
For example, I was interacting with the P2P guys like Michelle Bowen's group, and that was the first place that I came across it. And then just sort of touched in continuously, like every period of time. Like when the first blocks were minted, I started trying to figure out how to mine with an old laptop. I think I mined like maybe a tenth of a Bitcoin with a very old laptop before it was obviously not going to work. And then very hands-on, right? So the point, twofold. One was a nice place to actually look at the economic theory in practice. And then also a group of people that were gathering in different locations, Reddit and what was it called? Bitcoin Forum or something like that.
Bitcoin Talk, I think. Yeah,
Bitcoin Talk, who are coming with a, how would I say it? A heterodox perspective. Many of them were very unwashed and had their own perspectives, and a really beautiful opportunity to go deep on some fundamental principles and also notice how people think in general. So that's how I got involved. And more or less, I've been continuously involved since then, although cycling up and down. So, when the altcoin thing came, I sort of bought early Dogecoin and things like that and participated in that as an experiment of what's happening here and how does this work and what are these characteristics of this kind of thing, and then stepped back. And then, of course, Ethereum came and that sort of thing, like washing in and washing out.
Right. So, I mean, it seems to me like what I heard from you is that you're kind of a deeply experienced operator in the startup space, sort of understand money as a means of building a company, creating a social movement. And I'm not sure if I heard some sort of like dissatisfaction with that environment or not, but it seems like you're experimenting with more bleeding edge forms of digital money and peer-to-peer currency over time. And there's kind of an ebb and flow between those things. Anything to add there? And did I capture that right?
Yeah, maybe I'll make three little shifts. One is more in the direction of strategist than operator. Although I did, I was the CEO of the companies.
Okay.
My skill set is not actually at the level of, say, operations or even, frankly, at HR.
Okay.
But guiding and vision was just the thing that I was more naturally qualified for, to be perfectly frank, and to some extent communications, which is part of the CEO role.
Yeah.
The big picture is guided by actually a theory that I was working with in college, and largely has still been, of course, refined over the past 30 or 40 years, but continuous. I would say that I am, in fact, deeply dissatisfied, both experientially from a personal level and theoretically, with how money has shaped and continues to shape how people make choices and how we actually do things in the world. And so modifying money at the very base level plays, from my point of view, a decisive role in shifting things. It's like one of the longest levers, maybe the longest, but certainly one of the longest.
Okay. Maybe to pull on that, what is your vision for sort of money as a lever to make change? And I guess maybe another way of asking this question is, how did you come to found Game B? And what is your most recent work in exploring the Game B type idea?
So maybe just even to connect it to the previous part, there was a deep dive into, for example, the nature of money, which just kept going, right? As you start going down, you get into things like, how does society work? How does civilization work? What are the relationships between psychology and culture and technology? And as that continued to unfold, the primary inquiry was something like, if you consider the current circumstances to be, there are things that you'd like to change, and perhaps may need to, like there's a diagnostic, where are we headed? What is it likely to happen? And what's possible? My particular kind of mind likes to think about things as fundamentally as it can. So when I encounter a certain kind of problem, I want to say, okay, what's the more fundamental? Is there something more fundamental? And if so, what does that look like? Can I get down to a base layer, as robust a base layer as possible.
Right.
So eventually, this journey in collaboration with a lot of people actually led to the formulation of the notion of game A. So before you get to game B, you actually get to game A.
Right. Okay.
And I mean, it's more of a discovery, to be honest. It was okay. It seems to be the case, and I increasingly, over the past, almost decade now. No, actually more than a decade. 2010 was when that formulation really started to emerge. That, for example, all civilizations, everything that is not a strictly indigenous level of human activity, are of a kind. There's a certain set of conserved characteristics that are what I would call the civilization form, or the game A form.
Okay.
And that they all have certain characteristics, and there are, we're sort of moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic by playing with different variations on civilization. But from the point where we are now, the way I would describe it, I have described it, is that the totality of the arc of civilization is in fact playing out. We're reaching not the end of a given civilization, we're reaching the end of civilization as an entire kind of thing, which is to say we're reaching the end of game A as a kind of thing.
Okay.
And this is important from an agentic perspective, right? Because if you're trying to resolve a certain set of problems and you notice that the problems are actually driven by a more fundamental set of dynamics, then you have to actually deal with those dynamics. Otherwise, the problems will just keep coming back.
Right.
And then the challenge is, okay, if that's the case, what does it look like for us to actually find ourselves in a context that isn't driven by those same dynamics?
Right.
Right. So, okay, there's a game A, and it has a certain set of fundamental characteristics that lead to a certain set of dynamics, which lead to end conditions. Here we are. What's something other than that? Game B. And then working backwards, actually, what might be the kinds of characteristics, in fact, the necessary, sufficient, and compact characteristics of such a thing, a game that has not had the same sort of end states as game A. And so in many ways, it's a design exercise. We can go into as much depth as you'd like on what the results of that are, but roughly around 2012,
Right.
The process of the diagnosis of game A, oh shit, it is in fact was inexorably self-terminating, and we're kind of nearing the end of it, was relatively complete. We've done a lot of work on that since then, but that was there. And then, okay, what does this possible transition look like, and how might we make it? Like, there's two steps. What's a destination that's a valid destination to get to? To use evolutionary theory language, it would be what's a new hill on the landscape, a global optimal way out there. And then what's the transition? Like, how do we move across the valley? It's called a valley crossing exercise. Right? Those are the two questions.
Got it. So, I think that, what I heard was that we've sort of figured out there's a set of characteristics around how civilizations, at least here on Earth, evolve. And there's a worry that those characteristics might lead to self-terminating systems. Humanity blows itself up, doesn't pass the great filter. And I'm wondering if you can kind of give an example of a game A type game. I know when I talk to like Daniel Schmachtenberger, he talks about nuclear proliferation. The proliferation of CRISPR into many different hands will inevitably lead to disastrous self-terminating outcomes. But what's a tangible example for the audience of a game A type system?
I'll use a different approach because history is one of my habits. I'll actually just use history.
Okay.
The Roman Empire is a very nice example.
Okay.
A game A type system. And by the way, empire in general, like the very notion of empire. So you think about what is an empire.
Okay.
An empire is a particular kind of culture that has as its sort of nature the ingestion and integration by means of coercion other cultures. And that's an empire. And so, in case in point, in our current moment, the Russian Empire, and by the way, at this point, not trying to do any evaluation of that, but it's operating as an imperial mode, is on the process of using coercion, here embodied in the form of military technology. There are many other forms of coercion, by the way. Money is a perfectly valid form of coercion, as the West is quite familiar, to forcibly integrate a different culture, the Ukrainians, into its environment. So that's one of the canonical, one of the most fundamental game A moves is that. And if you sort of play forward the story of empire, notice the intrinsic dynamics, right? If the story of empire is played by more or less anybody on the planet,
Mhm.
Everybody else on the planet is now game theoretically stuck. You
Mhm.
either become feedstock, right? You're somebody else's lunch,
Yeah.
or you have to start playing a very similar game. And now you have conflicts between empires, right? So the boundary between the American empire and the Russian empire and the Chinese empire now becomes the boundary of the way that the world is created. But think about the implication, like the notion of the use of coercive capacity. So I've got multiple different groups that are constantly endeavoring to use coercive capacity with the sort of the intrinsic necessity of grabbing resources from each other. So now I'm in an arms race, like not metaphorically, an actual arms race. And the limit condition on that is going to be the limit condition on how far the arms race can go. And I might find myself in a temporary equilibrium where the expansive capacity of the various empires, the offensive capability of technology at the moment, and the defensive technology capability of technology at the moment mean that the boundaries are relatively stable. Say, for example, the implications of mutually assured destruction in the mid-century.
Right.
But if the underlying generator function is just you wait, I'm going to fuck you eventually,
Mhm.
then it's a temporary equilibrium. And if anything changes in the technical landscape, in the socio-technical landscape, in other words, the interior capacity of one or more of the agents,
Right.
the offensive, defensive, so the emergence, say, for example, of cyber war,
Mhm.
my hypothesis, or frankly, the what I call the war on sense making, psyops,
Right.
as offensive technologies that maybe changes the equilibrium, the Nash equilibrium, actually, mutually assured destruction, and you get another shift, right? And so the end state of this dynamic is ultimately, if you kind of run the clock forward, particularly given one more characteristic, by the way. So this last piece is important. In the arms race, notice that the arms race has an implication of, by necessity, an escalating and, in fact, accelerating technological capacity. Right? So we go from sticks and bones to nukes, etc. Right? It's an arrow that goes a certain direction, and it may actually down cycle a little bit. During the Bronze Age collapse, there was a small decrease in military capacity, but most of that was actually operational. Not too long after the Bronze Age collapse, actual military capacity, broadly speaking, was higher. Right, obviously.
Right.
So it's not too hard to draw the logical conclusions, right? If you've got an escalating arms race on a field that is defined by escalating capacity to engage in conflict, and any kind of conflict is naturally going to be throwing multiple different kinds of externalities into the environment,
Right.
producing things like radiation and things like that. There's a terminal point at some point in the future that is what we call either the eye of the needle or the keyhole, the bottleneck, or the great filter, if you like. So that's an example that includes a bunch of different ways of looking at it. And of course, you can expand from there.
Got it. Okay. So what I heard was basically there's a mode of human operation, game A, that basically not only is ultimately self-terminating on the long term, but in the short term, anyone who doesn't play under the game A rules kind of is maladapted. And so they get sucked into game A type operations. And at the same time this is happening, we have exponential technology, which is creating the capacity for self-destruction at larger and larger scales, destruction to the environment. So the stakes are getting higher all of the time as this is happening. I'm trying to say back to you what you just said to me, but let me know if that was a fair summary for the audience right there.
Yeah, very nice. I would just expand on one notion of environment.
Okay.
There's essentially three qualities or kinds of environment that are important to think about. One is we might think of as the external or the ecology, right? So the physical.
Okay.
The second is the culture, so the environment of the nature under which human beings are interacting with each other in some positive some way. And then the third is the environment of the interior of individuals, or the mind. And so these are three different frontiers, each one of which has externalities thrown into it by game A conflict. So a terminus of a given game A moment, like an empire, might be that it destroys its ecology and collapses on that basis. Say, for example, by at least some hypothesis, the Mayan Empire. Another terminus would actually be something like civil war or a breakdown of the cultural integration. And the third would actually be something like internal breakdown, like the actual psychologies of the individuals become less and less capable of operating their own machinery and interacting with each other, which creates sort of a hollowing out effect of the environment. So multiple different ways for it to fail, all of which are, of course, they're all always in play and always in relationship with each other, and of course in relationship with multiple different game A forces that are happening in the same global environment.
Okay, I see. So I guess, one of the sort of reasons why I wanted to chat with you is that you kind of speak this like deep theoretical game, this game theory, but you're also a technology entrepreneur and spending time discovering crypto. And I want to bring it back to crypto and Web3. I've watched a couple of your videos about Olympus DAO and a few other projects that you've been following. How do you think crypto sort of connects to solving these problems, if at all? What would have to be true for Web3 to build systems that pull people into more of a Game 3 mindset, or do they connect at all?
Well, they connect very deeply. I mean, one of the reasons why I've been so involved in this thing is that, let's take it two steps. You might imagine, although I suppose it's possible to be otherwise, that I take my own way of thinking seriously. And I actually do believe that we are at the end of something very significant and the consequences are large. And as you said, I have a history of agency. I have a history of creating things in the world that change things. And so I actually am trying to be agentic in this environment. So when I think about that at a very, very high level of strategy, okay, what are the levers that we could move on? So let's just go back to money for a moment. And I want to bring out a particular point of where we are now that I suppose is obvious, but I think it's very, very important, which is we're conscious of money. Up until relatively recently, money was sort of perceived by almost everyone, and even those who were involved in it at the Federal Reserve, for example, as being kind of like out there. It was a function of universe that we might participate in, like the rain falling. But it wasn't something that we took as being a subject of our intentional design, particularly not everybody or most people. Obviously, if you're involved at all in the crypto universe, you're on the other side of that conception. Right? It's obvious at this point that we, humans, design the money. Right? Tokenomics is a term. It's actually becoming an actual discipline. Okay, let's not just design it at all, but let's now think about how we design it skillfully. I call this alchemy. The conscious design of the various kinds of socio-technical systems that guide our collective choices. That's what I mean when I say alchemy.
Got it.
Here we are. Now, this is a very important thing. Right? If you take a look at the arc of history that I've been describing in the context of Game A, most of it is actually driven by unconscious, which is to say there's certain kinds of landscapes,
right?
Not the least of which is arms races, for example, and basic game theory, that drive choices in a direction towards termination at a certain point. But if we're conscious, if we're actually just able to look at the underlying landscape and consider making choices on the landscape itself, this is a qualitatively different circumstance. And in some sense, that's the essence of Game B, is the being conscious about designing our own landscape, which is not true, by the way.
So it sounds like the agency over these problems is sort of like a key inflection point for humanity, is that multiple people can sense make if they're not even at if they're not at the Federal Reserve, then before they had no agency over these problems. But now with open source money, you can program your values into your money. You can sense make about how to build a more Game B system, and you can actually you've got a better starting position. Yeah, well, okay. I'm going to actually break that into 2 points and make them very sensitive. So one is you actually have agency, you can. And then the second is you can actually become aware of the possibility of thinking about how to design. And so there's different modes. And it's actually the first mode is obviously critical. We have to actually have agency over designing our landscapes. But the second mode is, okay, what is this thing where how do we go about thinking about this? What does it mean to take tokenomics as a field of design and as a whole discipline? Like that fact of being, we can actually now do game design. Game A, game B. Game A in many ways was an unconscious discovery Right.
Humans just participating in humaning of a particular set of constructs that produce results in the world. And in this explosion of the imperial mode, for example, in cities, by the way. And B is, oh, shit, we can actually engage in game design. Well, what kind of game would we like to design? And that actually is a completely different set of questions. It involves things like would, right? The subjunctive. So let's see. So Web3 is, I think, the defining moment is the question of whether or not Web3, individually and collectively, steps into consciousness of what it's doing. It's like, well, wait a minute. What are we doing? Right? Not unconsciously exploring the field of how do I make more tokens by playing in the game, right? Which is fundamentally running the essence of game A. But actually stepping out big picture, saying, well, what are we doing here? And what would effective choices look like in the context of what we're doing? Like that, just in that space, just sitting right there, is the essence of the shift. And of course, the possibility. So, yeah, let me hit on that. I mean, it's obvious for you, and I think for almost everybody who might be listening, but that accelerating technology field, and the fact of the capacity of technology moving on a curve. If you're looking at the context of late stage neoliberalism, which is the environment that we're operating in, and you say, geez, it's going to be really hard to fix that. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of inertia. There's a lot of power in the world.
Right.
Well, if you want to address it, you need to actually have something which in principle has the capacity to have at least that much of power or more, right? It's sort of a very simple metaphor. If you say, late stage globalism, right? The whole neoliberal global thing coming out of the 20th century is very heavy and it has a certain weight to it. Then if you want to move it, you need to have something which has at least that amount of power that can lift that weight and move it, right?
I see.
Well, it looks like the technologies associated with blockchain have that amount of power.
Right.
We've got this accelerating curve, the coordination capacity that is implicit in these kinds of technologies, which the current environment doesn't operate on, right? The current environment is basically an analog environment that's somewhat kludged into digital, right? There's sort of like fax machine. It's a fax machine bureaucracy that uses email. Like that's the operating environment of our sort of legacy institutions. And if you can teleport from that, which is, let's say, operating at one, into something which is designed thoughtfully and intrinsically on the basis of what's available in a truly digital context, it has, say, it's a power of, 10 to 100, a lot. And that's enough to move things, right? So it's actually, we're sitting here going, hey, guys, 2 points. One, you actually have the capacity to build something which could, in principle, completely move the entire world, like all of it, like literally shift all the result. Everything that's happening could be shifted because the power is implicit in the underlying infrastructure. And you can be conscious about it. You can actually thoughtfully design the things we're trying to get to with sort of purpose and values behind it. So those are the two things. And to the degree to which Web3 realizes, holy shit, we're not, the end game of this is not to make slightly more money in USD. That's not even vaguely the end game. The end game is actually, no, we can and in some sense must design a completely different infrastructure for how human beings coordinate and operate. That has more than enough underlying implicit power to shift at a purely military level, like to use the game A language. It is more powerful than existing empires. But if it's held in a particular quality of consciousness, it can do so from a new basis, the game B basis, and therefore shift things at in a qualitative level, not just become the next great empire.
Right. So, I mean, I think that what I hear in your voice is a lot of potential energy in the ability to use crypto as a basis when rooted in game B thinking, rooted in conscious thinking, to solve for systemic risks. Not to just use crypto as a tool to enrich yourself, but when you realize that there are deeply systemic risks to humanity that are proliferating in the world, to start to bend your entrepreneurial activities, your work in the Web3 ecosystem towards creating a more game B type world, which hopefully solves for those existential risks. And I guess I'm just wondering, is that what you see out there? Like, let's really pressure test this. Like, when you look at Web3, are people actually doing that right now? Or is it all, NFTs? Like, what are you observing out there, and how can we bend more builders towards orienting in game B type thinking? If the answer is that there's a disconnect between that potential energy and what you actually see out there.
Well, let's see. I would kind of maybe make three points seem to light up.
Mm-hmm.
So one, not at all unexpectedly, I would say the vast majority of activity is still very much operating in the unconscious mode,
Okay.
which is just called an evolutionary exploration of the possibility of the landscape. And like the migration to empty GOX, from empty GOX across to Coinbase, and then to DeFi. Right, this is in many ways almost like feeling out the landscape by hand, noticing certain upgradient trajectories, and then going there. Right.
Yeah.
An evolutionary process. So that's that dominates, and that isn't surprising. Like, okay. The second, which I think is quite hopeful, is the trajectory of the evolutionary process does actually seem to be oriented towards, how do I say this right? Discovering, or in many cases rediscovering, deeply fundamental characteristics that are, say, part of a hopeful future. And then let me just expand on that. Let's use NFTs. It's a fun one. So yeah, for sure. And the NFT space is very largely driven by an unconscious exploration. No question. But this concept, and this is I don't know how many people this will land with, but I'll see how far how clearly I can articulate this.
Mm-hmm.
I'll make a proposition that the naming convention tells us a lot. And the proposal I'll make is that it tells us that we're actually very backwards in our thinking fundamentally, because we have a distinction between tokens and non-fungible tokens.
Right.
And what I would say is that in fact it ought to actually be the opposite in a healthy, thoughtful universe. Token should intrinsically be non-fungible. Fungibility should be the unusual characteristic. And so what do I mean by that? It's a very weird story, but I think it's worth sort of hitting on, because if it hits nicely, people will get it. If you look at the etymology of the word token, and by the way, I think that a lot of the naming elements have an interesting poetry to them, like the name of Ethereum, which doesn't feel at all like the kind of thing that would come out of a nerd space, is quite an interesting esoteric orientation. So token, the word token is one of the most sacred words. Right? The word token means to speak solemnly, to token. Right? It's an Anglo-Saxon, Germanic word, and it's very much associated with like the shamanic role of assigning a symbol to an aspect of the subtle reality. Right? So when we perceive something, like let's say a god or a natural event that we want to give to orient towards, we name it, which is a very interesting process that humans do. Only humans, right? We see like tree or oak, and we say oak. We actually utter this sound, which is nothing at all like the physical tree, but we bind the two together, right? And that notion is tokening, to give a name to something. And it's a solemn act, right? To betoken something is about as fundamental a solemn act as there can be. It is magic per se in the fundamental sense, and it's singular. It is non-fungible. To token something is precisely singular. Oak is a pointer, a single pointer, a single word that points towards essentially an essence. It calls forth into the mind the notion of essence, like the Platonic idea. So to betoken is in fact to discern singular essences in universe and then assign them unique tags that allow them to be legible in communication. Right? That set of words, by the way, that's a really good set of words I just uttered. I'm betokening something. I'm literally action. Okay, well that's singular, right? Singular and non-fungible are the same term, right? The fact that the oak is not alder is the point. Right? The essence is non-fungible. And fungibility is a really weird thing. Fungibility is like, okay, well, I'm going to kind of pretend that they're all alike. I'm
the same,
shifting from a qualitative mode to a quantitative mode. So, well, okay, how many oak? Well, now I'm going to start taking the uniqueness of each distinct oak tree, which is, of course, itself perfectly unique, right? Everything in the universe is, in fact, completely singular and will never return in its specificity. I'm going to analytically elide, I'm going to decontextualize that specificity into an artificial characteristic, whatever I particularly care about that I'm trying to optimize for. And that's going to be the fungible thing, right? So my proposition is that the contextual, the fully contextual, which of course now means a field of singularities in the context of an infinite wholeness, which can be navigated by betokening uniqueness, is more fundamental and is more of the essence, by the way, life and game B. And this movement of making things fungible is a big part of the fundamental characteristic of game A, and is, let's say, artificial. And I don't necessarily mean horrible. I just mean that's a different kind of thing. It's finite by its very nature, right? And it's the beginning of the process of, in fact, closure. It moves things into a thermodynamic, entropic cycle. So in our evolutionary exploration of NFT space, we are, on the one hand, operating under the logic of fungibility, which means we're looking to monetize things. But on the other hand, because it is actually more fundamental, we cannot help but actually be discovering the contours of what I'll call essential space, or the essence. It's sloppy, to be sure, right? It's very sloppy. In many ways being driven by vibes, right? Vibes is a very nice mode, right? Vibes is actually aesthetics, right? Orienting towards essence from a modality that is not driven by construct, but is actually endeavoring to navigate the underlying topography of the essential landscape. And so we're actually rediscovering, reawakening in ourselves. Many have called this actually a medieval mindset, a more mythic mindset that has a proper relationship with the underlying ground of being. And that's really good, right? So then I would just propose, hey, okay, cool. Why don't we be conscious about it? Why don't we actually use our capacity to think clearly about things and achieve a higher level of effectiveness by just knowing what it is we're actually doing? Yeah, let me just hit on that note for a moment, because this is, I think one of the you're really, really pushing on well is this question of public goods. Yeah, and to use a certain kind of set of concepts that are how do I say, powerful. They're very strong concepts.
Right.
The distinctions that I make are between rivalrous, non-rivalrous, and anti-rivalrous goods. And the public goods category is sort of the right hand too. So the non-rivalrous and the anti-rivalrous. So an example, which I think is quite nice. Let me take a book. And in fact, let's take a specific book. Do I have it here? Well, I'll just take, funny, I won't take that one. We'll take this one.
Looking forward to seeing what book this is.
Yeah. I'm actually, let's see which one. Oh, I'll use this one. There we go. So many books here that are off screen, but I'm not going to share with you all the ones I'm choosing. So we'll go with this one. This is a very nice book, by the way.
Okay.
War in the Age of Intelligent Machines. Manuel. Okay. I was hoping that I had a copy of McLuhan's Understanding Media, but it's not right there. Okay. So I've got a book. Okay. This subject is rivalrous. Right? I've got this book. You don't have this book. And if you have this book, I have this book. Rivalrous. Right. And the way, to the degree to which this book degrades over time entropically. Yeah. I spill coffee on it, I burn it, whatever. It's just gone, right? The rivalrous has two primary characteristics. One is it's not shareable other than by moving it from one agent to another agent. And two, once it's gone from universe, it's gone from universe. Yeah. But it can be taken as non-rivalrous in the context of being a public good by putting it in a library. So I currently have it fully rivalrous. I own it. It's in my house. You can't even fucking touch it. But if I take it out of the library and then I put it back in the library and then you can access it, we are able to sort of more fully share its utility until it's degraded, right? So that's public goods from the point of view of the non-rivalrous. We're trying to find some way of sharing, right? The sharing. The difference between a personal car and, say, a train or a bus. It's more shared. But then we have the anti-rivalrous. And it's almost like, if you think about this as a line, I think it's the wrong metaphor. It's actually more like that. Right. If you go from the rivalrous to the non-rivalrous, when you go to the anti-rivalrous, you're actually making an oblique turn into a completely different dimension, like from the X to the Y plane. Okay. And that's the content of the book. Right, which is fully transcendent to any given specific mediation. Yeah, right? Medium. Yeah. I can say, okay, if I were to take this and put it into a PDF, it's the same content, maybe slightly different. The medium is the message, but more or less the same. And there's something about that, because that has shareability in a very different quality than this. Yeah. I mean, the content is now plausibly universally shareable. Everybody in the entire planet could have the PDF of this without any particular constraint. There's a very small constraint, which is the energetic constraint that is the binding of any piece of transcendence instantiated in physical reality. And that's important. But we're on a very different trajectory if we're orienting ourselves around the anti-rivalrous characteristics and trying to build something which is coordinating around the anti-rivalrous. The reason why I'm bringing that up is let's do this. So this is the notion of consciousness. It's the notion of thinking in terms of meta strategy and in terms of principles. So let's say I take a particular book, Understanding Media by Marshall. And I think, well, what is the more fundamental lesson of that? Like, so there's the book itself is nice, but the content is more fundamental than the book. Clearly, I want to learn the lessons that he's teaching. I don't necessarily care about physically the book. Like, I use it as a doorstop, but that's not the point.
Yeah.
But when I think about the lessons of that particular book, I notice something, that there's something more fundamental than that. Itself, the actual content of that particular book points me to the practice of thinking about the implications of media on mind. Do you notice the move there? And it's like, well, okay, I could give you a fish. I could teach you how to fish. I could teach you how to learn how to teach yourself how to fish. Right? That second move is a very different kind of move. Actually empowering you not with the specific capacity of fishing, but the general capacity of learning skill. Then I could orient your consciousness of the general capacity of learning skill around the universality of learning about learning. This is Sufism as an entire discipline is essentially that. How do we go ahead and say, all right, well, the most powerful potential move would become exquisite in meta learning, and because everything else is a derivative of meta learning at a human level. Okay, if I had sort of super high quality capacity at meta learning, when I find myself in any given context, I can instantiate a optimal learning capacity in relationship with that context. Then I can learn the characteristics of that context. Now, that's an extremely powerful abstraction that I just articulated, but this is, it's not that complex. Lots of different people have thought this sort of thing. You think Sun Tzu in The Art of War, right? The notion of strategy is exactly what I'm just describing, saying, hey guys, we can actually think about war as an object. We can actually step outside of it, and we can think about how do we just get good? What are the principles of war? Like, fuck, this is not just random. There's characteristics of this fucking thing. Let's think about the characteristics and get really, really good at the stuff that matters. How about that? How about we just use our capacity to think about things, discern the principles and the characteristics, how they relate to each other, focus our limited time and energy on the stuff that actually matters and get really good at it. Right? That basic idea. If I take that and I just feed it into itself a couple of times, then I get a very powerful machine, a very powerful engine. Okay. How do I find the things that matter in terms of discerning the things that matter and get really good at that? This, by the way, is the term sovereignty that I think you mentioned in the document you sent me.
Living a bankless life requires taking control over your own private keys. And that's why so many in the Bankless Nation already have their Ledger hardware wallet. And brand new to the Ledger lineup of hardware wallets is the Ledger Nano S Plus, a huge upgrade to the world's most popular hardware wallet. With more memory and a larger screen, the Nano S Plus makes it easy to navigate and verify your transactions. And the paired Ledger Live desktop app gives you increased transparency as to what is about to happen with your NFT. What you see is what you sign. The Nano S Plus gives you the smoothest possible user experience while you're doing all of your crypto things. So go to the Ledger website to check out the features of the new Ledger Nano S Plus and join the waitlist to get yours. And don't forget about the Crypto Life card, also powered by Ledger. The CL card is a crypto debit card that hooks right into the Ledger Live app, right next to all the DeFi apps and services that you're already used to doing, like swapping tokens and staking. So if you don't have a Ledger hardware wallet, go to ledger.com, grab a Ledger, and take control over your crypto. Arbitrum is an Ethereum scaling solution that's going to completely change how we use DeFi and NFTs. Over 250 projects have already deployed on Arbitrum, and Arbitrum's DeFi and NFT ecosystems are growing rapidly. Arbitrum increases Ethereum speed by orders of magnitude for a fraction of the cost of the average gas fee. When interacting with Arbitrum, you can get the performance of a centralized exchange while tapping into Ethereum's level of decentralization and security. If you're a developer who wants low gas fees and instant transactions for your users, visit developer.offchainlabs.com to get started building your application on Arbitrum. If you're a user, keep an eye out for your favorite DeFi apps or NFT projects building on Arbitrum. Many of your favorite apps are already live, with many more coming over soon. You can find these apps at portal.arbitrum.one, and you can bridge your assets over to Arbitrum using bridge.arbitrum.io in order to experience DeFi and NFTs the way it was always meant to be: fast, cheap, and friction-free.
The thread I want to pull on here, and you know, I'd asked you, like, basically how does Web3 build more game B systems, and then we started talking about the evolutionary trajectory of the exploration of the design space of Web3 being a trajectory, like just framing it as evolutionary to me is, I think, so important, because there are several epochs, and you know, there's you know, mimetic selection, and it seems like the evolutionary process, like the question I was gonna ask you was, you know, like, how do we just speed run this evolution so that like all the, you know, like the stuff that's unconscious like dies out, and like how do we speed run it till we get to the evolutionary equivalent of like mycelium networks or dolphins or like mammals or whatever, which is, you know, evolution is not omnidirectional, so it'll go in many different directions. But then you kind of told me about this sort of like metaphor for like, instead of like giving someone a fish or teaching them to fish, you teach them how to learn, and then from there they can learn how to fish. And I think that, you know, the way I connect those two thoughts is that if Web3 builders are learning about learning, and they can save all the time of traversing the design space by trying things, but they can learn about how to build systems that create more coordination as a meta characteristic. This is the way I connect the thoughts in my head. Am I at all pulling on a thread of where you're going with this?
Yes, it's a very nice way of putting it. By the way, I really like using the simple, sort of the legible metaphor of speedrunning. It's nice. I think you're dead on. You know, the notion is something like, I can either sit on a landscape and run around the landscape and look at that ground level and say, oh shit, okay, there's a, like, think about being in a maze. Like, I'm in a maze. And the walls are very tall, so I'm just running around the maze, and I have to explore the maze. Or what would happen if I could just go up and look at the whole fucking thing from above?
Yeah, that's the topography. Yeah.
Can you take a higher perspective on the entire problem domain, notice its basic characteristics, and then make a very simple teleportation to the location that you want to get to? That's the human thing. That's what humans can do. And I should say, by the way, every single human being who is more capable of engaging in that exercise is able to actually outcompete everyone else.
So that's the anti-rivalrousness of the book, I think, going back to that point, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it's a very interesting dynamic between the rivalrousness that is embedded in the capacity to more fully participate in the anti-rivalrous. This is a very important point. So if I can navigate the intrinsic anti-rivalrous more effectively than you can, one of the things that happens is I can actually outcompete you in the domain of the rivalrous. But if you and I enter into a space of collaboration,
right,
our collective capacity to navigate the anti-rivalrous is better than any given individual capacity. So that move is like a funny, like it gets turned on its head. So yes, for example, Elon Musk is a perfect example of somebody whose individual asymmetric capacity to simply navigate at the level of the anti-rivalrous, to step outside of the maze and say, well, shit, SpaceX, Tesla, batteries, solar, they're all kind of part of the same landscape. If I do this, this, and this, I'll sort of teleport across. Of course, the electric car is trivial. Right? That's more or less what he did. Remember, he sat down and said, here's what I'm going to do over this period of time. Pop, pop, pop. How did he do that? Well, he just popped up from the landscape, looked at its characteristics, identified some fundamental levers like the implication of Moore's law in the context of batteries, was able to make some shifts on the basis of a completely different view of the landscape, wasn't engaging in an evolutionary process, but was engaging in design or consciousness process, and outcompeted, you know, essentially everybody in the entire automotive industry, for example. But there is a limit of his particular individual capacity to engage in this exercise, which is very high, to be sure. And there's a valley crossing associated with collaboration, meaning if I enter into collaboration with you, our collective intelligence, just to use that as language, our collective capacity to navigate the anti-rival risk actually goes down for a while than either of us individually, because of course I've spent a whole lifetime being coherent with myself. So I'm really, I understand my own language. I have a lot of capacity to do my insights. You're optimized and toned for yourself. We don't really know each other very well. So it takes a while for us to learn how to collaborate. But there's a point at which the potential of our collaboration is actually larger than the actual of our individual. Right? So our actual collaboration is going to go down. But if we're skillful at collaboration and we work our way through it to a certain point, the actual collaboration of we, or a new kind of agent, which is now both of us, is higher than where we were as individuals. By the way, just so we're clear, that statement, what I just said there, is me teleporting outside of the landscape of navigating the anti-rival risk, a whole other move, right? I made just two moves. First move is moving out of the domain of the actual, looking at it and saying, well, the anti-rival risk is a way of navigating. Oh, shit, well, what if I think about the anti-rival risk as a domain and pop out one level higher? And that's the state of collaboration. Right? In principle, a collective intelligence that is composed of the largest number of nodes, where each node individually has the highest capacity in itself and in collaboration. Those are two characteristics. Will have the highest total potential, and to a degree which is coherent, which is to say that it has achieved a frictionless or noiseless integration of its ambient potential. It'll actually have the highest actual capacity to navigate the space of the anti-rival risk. That, by the way, is an end. That's that phrase I just said there, sort of an end of the journey of exploring the space of game B. And so if you're trying to think of what would be the sort of the ultimate strategy in sort of all possible worlds, that's it. Like that's the ultimate strategy in all possible worlds, is to inculcate or to catalyze or participate in the autopoiesis of such a kind of thing. Right? A kind of collective intelligence which has as its intrinsic that it brings into itself individual intelligences in a fashion which actually increases their specificity and their particularity, meaning each individual person who participates in Game B is able to live their own values even better than any circumstance where they're not in Game B, and becomes more sovereign, more capable of expressing and living their lives functionally and effectively in the world by virtue of participating in Game B. That's the essence of what it is. And is able to do so in a space of increasingly effective collaboration with everyone else. Right? So the net sum of that integration across the number of people is the largest possible field of capacity to navigate the anti-rival risk, which then, of course, means it has decisive strategic advantage of everything that's happening in the space of the rival risk.
Right.
Now back to the Web3 folks. The question now is not theoretic; it's actually practical. Like the theoretical statement is there. Now it's the practical question of how. How do we actually implement various kinds of coordination structures that are guided by these principles that actually begin the process of moving individuals increasingly along the trajectory, right? Because you are where you are. If you haven't yet even learned how to learn, we're going to have to, right? If you're stuck in a certain location, that you have to take a first step. And that I think is really where Web3 is moving from the unconscious exploration of NFT space to more and more people actually having a conscious location and saying, okay, how do I build things like the onboarding problem? It's very practical, right?
Yeah.
You've got a problem that this fucking thing's hard to use. And you really sort of either super greedy, super motivated, or super nerdy to onboard. Well, we need to onboard effectively everybody in a certain order, by the way, not necessarily everybody all at once. Okay, that's a very practical problem. And it's a learning problem. Right? We actually have to find a way to help people learn how to navigate in this new environment. And it's a learning problem in a lot of different ways. It's not just a UI problem. We're actually teaching people whole new ways to identify who they are, to find out how to meet their needs in the world. Like it's a whole challenge. So we can like pivot everything I just said to the very practical of the onboarding problem in Web3 and think, can we use this architecture to say, okay, what are the things that are ready at hand? Like what are the low-hanging fruit in the landscape that we already have our hands on free? Do that And can we think, what are the most meaningful ones? What are the highest leverage ones? What are the most urgent? Like that kind of stuff.
Yeah. One of the things that, really stuck out to me from what you said is that like this increasing field of collective intelligence comprised of several different nodes that are increasing in intelligence and capacity can learn for themselves. And catalyzing that movement is sort of like the first thing that could possibly happen. And I'm wondering, it kind of reminds me of how I think that I kind of have this theory that education is anti-fragility. The more people understand the importance of public goods and can say it in their own words relative to their own sovereign place in the world, the more that creates anti-fragility for the world's public goods. Like that movement is important. But I guess I'm wondering, once we've established that increasing field of people learning to learn and looking at the ecosystem, like what else do we focus on? Like, if you're looking at the landscape from up here, what else do you see up there? Like, what else should people be focusing on once we've catalyzed this increasing collective intelligence field? Like from within that, what do we focus on next?
Okay, well, let's see. You've got a fundamental scarcity in the domain of attention. So what we want to do is we want to liberate people two-dimensionally. We want to liberate them from wasting their attention. So let's say bullshit jobs is a good example. And we also want to liberate them from spending their attention foolishly. They're not quite the same. They're similar, but they're not quite the same. So endless doom scrolling on Twitter is spending your attention foolishly. And going through a bullshit job is being stuck or being constrained in how you're spending your attention. Now, these are two kind of different sorts of problems. One is we want to generate environments, and just think about meta leverage. What I want to do is I want to identify the individuals whose attention is the most leverageable. So Vitalik's attention is more leverageable than most people's, right? Because he has a capacity to sort of lead the generation of Ethereum, which has a lot of implications, right? So I want to identify the individuals whose attention is the most leverageable. I want to liberate them from wasting their fucking time, but then I want to go deeper. I want to actually work with them in a developmental educational program so that they can increasingly more effectively orient their attention towards the most relevant locations for their particular quality of capacity in the world as it is. Right. So look at sort of the what is it called? There was a great book. There's the Education of Young Werner, I think it was. Something like that. There's the Education of Young Vitalik. Like, okay, Vitalik, your sort of basic developmental environment caused you to orient towards this thing, blockchain as world computer. Nice.
Right.
I've noticed, and I pay a lot of attention, he has continuously had a series of epiphanies. Right.
Right.
Oh, shit, right? Write about it, DAO.
Yeah.
Governance, shit. Okay, write about it, right? So he keeps having these epiphanies. And of course, what we'd like to do is have him have a meta epiphany. What is this arc of epiphanies? What kinds of practices might I personally, Vitalik, undergo? What kind of contexts might I put myself in, both physically and relationally, that have this characteristic of maximally upgrading my own stream of epiphany, so that I am unlocking my own attention into more and more meaningful orientation, right? So
it's like the second derivative of more epiphanies, like optimizing for that. Yeah,
exactly. Now notice what happens. To the degree to which we're actually able to identify and liberate those whose attention has the highest amount of leverage, and then support them on the second derivative of the stream of epiphany, so that their attention is increasingly relevant and meaningful in attending to the world, you get an explosion, right? And every single person who is on that field is now freeing up more possibility for liberating more people across both dimensions. That's what we need to do, right? It's just that. Just do that.
We've kind of established that we're going to identify the people whose attention is the most leverageable, liberate them from wasting their time, and liberate them from spending their attention foolishly. Whether that's reporting on a bullshit job or endlessly doom scrolling on Twitter. And, I can't help but think that, some of the work that we're doing at Gitcoin with trying to get people to be able to quit their jobs and work on public goods, we've kind of just like stumbled up into this domain that you're talking about here. Not to, talk my own book at Gitcoin too much, but like, I guess like how can, how do we how do we like liberate the world's attention? I mean, it reminds me of at the start you were talking about having to compete with game A type systems to even survive. Like, how do we compete with Twitter with a mechanism that's better at like sense making and doesn't like attention hijack you with these crazy like limbic hijacks and race to the bottom of the brainstem? Like, how do we get out of that?
So let's sort of do the thing. First order is noticing that asking questions is a useful thing to do. Yeah.
Right.
That until you've actually gotten to the point where you're asking the right kinds of questions, you are ultimately behaving in a random fashion. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are at any given point in time able to actually get to the deepest, most fundamental questions, and certainly answer them well. But it does generally mean that if we're not operating in that mode of saying, wait a minute, slow down. What are the relevant questions here? To what degree do we understand what we're about? Can we maybe ask, let's just take a pause and ask some more deep questions and get to some level of, okay, yeah, we've got a good handle on the shape of the space that we're operating in. Now we need to go out and just explore it. And there's an evolutionary process in every phase, right? You still have to explore the space that you're operating in to some extent. So I'll give you an example. From my point of view, there's nothing that's happening right now in the broad strokes that wasn't obvious back in 2010.
Right.
It was evident that we were going to, I mean, literally, I remember sitting down and writing down, there's going to be NFTs. Literally, we were calling them NFTs, which I don't understand how we got that language, but we're, NFTs.
Right.
And by the way, I don't know what they're going to be called, but the NFT, right? Non-transferable, non-fungible token.
Right. Soulbound is what Vitalik calls them. Yeah.
Soulbound. Oh, I like that. That's very nice.
Yeah.
That's super nice because it calls out the notion of soul, which is the intrinsic, right? The most fundamental aspect, which is non-fungible and non-transferable, is actually your soul. And then everything that is accumulated to that by essence would be soul-bound. See, this is beautiful. That's the aesthetic. That's the vibe. Good vibe. So we can do that, where there's a mapping process. What can we step back for a little bit and take a look at the overall landscape and identify what are the areas that have certain necessity? We're going to need to deal with them.
Right.
And by the way, can we have a sense of timing? Like, okay, at what point do we need to be thinking about how do we really, really deal with the regulatory consequences of the legacy financial system? About 9 to 12 months ago. Right, that's the threshold where this was something where we could, in principle, begin the process of actually organizing, using our collaborative capacity and the resources under control to begin consciously designing new approaches to jacking the regulatory system. I mean, the word jacking, right? Because it's already jacked. We're just sort of taking over the existing kind of cybernetic control structure that finance built over the last 50 years and saying, hey, cool, you've built the cybernetic control structure over our political and regulatory environment. We're just going to use that. We'll just plug into that and use that better. We're going to lobby more efficiently. We're going to kind of like create new kind of gateways for politicians, like all that kind of stuff. We're going to fund elections more effectively, that kind of shit. Like we're just going to play your game. And maybe we'll invent 2 or 3 more things, but we have to win that piece of the strategic landscape. Like you're looking at the map going, hey, I want to get to this hill over here. And to get to that hill, there's a valley right here. We're going to have to get across. That valley is called navigate the political and regulatory environment around finance and in conflict with, to some extent, TradFi. Okay, cool. That's a piece. That's one part, right? Literally just that part of looking at the long arc, trying to see what the map looks like, identifying where the significant valleys are, and where are we on that trajectory, and when's the right time for us to begin focusing, right? So that's one answer to the question. Another answer to the question is, let's call it like developmental, like at the level of individuals. Like what are the various things that are very leverageable and very general in terms of developmental arcs of individuals. Right? So how do I accelerate a given person's trajectory across the second derivative of epiphany? And what are the various blocks? Right? And there's a lot, by the way. We've got a huge amount of understanding of how important it is to become embodied as opposed to being in a disassociated space. A lot of Web3, less Web3. So if I say like Bitcoin, let's go Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, blockchain, Web3 is kind of like names of certain kinds of eras.
Right.
Web3 is more embodied than Bitcoin was by a lot. And by the way, also blockchain and cryptocurrency, there's just more awareness of being bodies in the world and not just pure abstract minds. But the point is that there's a bunch of practices that are associated with embodiment, and there's an awareness, there's actually a science, a whole sort of discipline understanding why and how embodied intelligence has a fundamental role to play in navigating environments, particularly collaborative environments. Like this question of governance in DAOs. Let's take that one. This is actually very nice. DAOs. Yep, it was going to happen for sure. And I fucking wrote about it a long time ago.
Yeah.
And it's going to look like this. And one of the problems of DAOs at the very top of the stack is going to be this question of governance. The question of governance is going to involve more or less three moves. One move is the conscious or unconscious disaggregation of the habits and inertia of legacy concepts around what governance is and how it operates. This is sort of a reinventia. Like we come in with a notion of governance, which is basically just a copy paste. Oh, it's like Congress and constitutions and shit like that. It's like old stuff. Not really, right? It's more fundamental. We have to kind of like dissolve the forms that it's congealed into in the past, reduce it back into its fundamental characteristics. Then we have to explore how to embody it in new forms. So the first move is sort of chemical dissolution. The second move is the discovery of the new forms. But then the third move is, in fact, the recognition of the embodiment of entirely new kinds of beings in the context of the new forms. They both, they relate to each other. If you're... To use kind of an old-fashioned example, if I'm building governance around literacy, around books, like around like constitutions, I have to have people who know how to read, right? Both are important. I have to have both sides of it. I can say right now, DAO governance is at least 50% individual human beings becoming more capable of engaging in self-driven collaboration. Right? So it's the practice of becoming ones who can participate is as fundamental as kind of like the formal rules and the structures and the intuitions. And then, of course, we've got the actual instantiation of the institutional structures, which much of which will be embodied in code in this environment. A lot of which will be embodied in pure culture, by the way, not so much in doctrine like law and sort of written stuff in the middle. It's code and culture are the two places that are actually stronger. So that, by the way, so there you go. Like that's a way of looking at the problem from above, noticing the sort of the primary things that need to be thought about. And then we can say, okay, now how do we begin the process of doing things like, what's the most effective way to address a given problem? Let's just run through that as a question. Well, one answer is put the people for whom it is the most fundamental inquiry for them on that problem.
Right.
It's not a good idea to put me on a problem that I don't really care about. The people who really care intrinsically should be the ones who are oriented towards a given problem. Design the approach to the problem, which is proper for the nature of the problem itself.
Right.
Right. These are just sort of principles that you may in fact seem banal, but for God's sakes, if you actually just go through the steps, Notice what is the totality of the human typologies that need to be present to a particular problem to have an adequate perspective to perceive the problem in its wholeness so that you can actually grasp the problem properly and address it for real. That's another piece. Like this notion of diversity is thoughtlessly applied. There's a very thoughtful approach, right? I don't need 3 eyes right now. I need 2. And I need 2 perspectives to have binocular vision. A 5th eye would not really particularly helpful. So now it's diversity that's getting confusing and makes my visual cortex have a hard time processing. 1 is a problem. I need 2, right? What's that look like in any given problem? Can I get a sense of, have we actually got the right perspectives here to really hold this thing in all of its particulars so that we can address it comprehensively and effectively? Is everybody here actually motivated by values? Do you actually something you truly care about intrinsically? Maybe not. Again, we're moving from a place to another place. In many cases, you always have to, you fight with the army that you got, not the army you want. Yes. Right. And you're constantly trying to evolve the quality of the army you've got so that it's more and more effective in the context of where you actually are.
Yeah.
By the way, so I could go on and on, but you kind of get it, right? There's a whole sort of basic set of heuristics and principles and rules that allow us to use conscious process to grasp the particulars of a problem domain and make the most effective choices that we can at a given moment, not the least of which constant upgradient of the aforementioned.
Right. Yeah, and I think that the upside out there for the builders who are listening is that as opposed to unconsciously exploring the design space and maybe stepping in a bear trap, this allows you to kind of go above the design space, see it from above, and then more skillfully navigate the design space.
Yeah, and I again back to this notion of there seems to be something about the nature of this space where it is uncovering this stuff on its own.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing this all the time. I'm seeing things like principles of composability. Right? That's actually in complete alignment with what I just said.
Mm-hmm.
I've noticed that a lot of the conversations are actually operating at a level of thinking about what they're trying to do before they do it.
Yeah.
Basic orientations towards of collaboration. What's his name? Punk6529. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Some of his tweet threads are fucking gold, and they're tweet threads. Right. So that's the anti-rivalrous. He's actually in himself, or I assume it's a he, contemplating deeply certain problems, expressing them with a care for certain levels of clarity and precision in a public forum for all who choose to hear. Right, that's very high leverage, very good stuff. Now, by doing what I'm doing, to the degree to which you think my discernment is useful, I'm now providing you my quality of discernment, orienting your attention away from something that may be less valuable or less effective towards something that may be more valuable or more effective. And by the way, I'm also calling out, hey, Punk 6529, how do you continue to do a better job?
Yeah.
Which, by the way, meta collaboration. I am completely in a conspiracy, a conscious conspiracy with Punk 6529 to make Punk 6529 the best punk he could ever be. Because everything he does better in this fashion recurses back to the entire environment, anti-rivalry, right? And the whole system gets better. So that's like public goods on public goods.
Yeah, the derivative of public goods. Is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say to this audience?
Yeah. So I've been around for a little while. I'm a little older than 50, and I've been involved in the tech space since I was like 9, maybe 8.
Yeah.
And paying attention, like watching, like noticing how different things have cycled through. And one of the things that I feel is sad, just makes me feel bad, is how often opportunities have been missed. The best possibility, like my own particular arc, the cypherpunk arc. Oddly enough, P. Mark commented on this recently. I don't know exactly what he meant, but he said like cypherpunk sure turned out differently than my teenage self thought it would. And I said, I hear you, because my teenage self was also tuning into the cypherpunk thing and thought it would turn out differently than it did. And I would say, let's not do that this time.
Yeah.
Let's fucking nail it. Like, let's do that. Let's set ourselves the objective of fucking nailing it. Let's dial it in. There's no point in not. I can tell you this: the great filter is a thing. We're heading towards a likely split, but we can stick the landing on this. It'll be amazing if we pull it off, and vastly better than any number of bags getting bigger or whatever number goes up feels like. Meaningfulness itself and its most fundamental characteristic is literally waiting to be had if all we do is set ourselves the absolute commitment to nail it.
I love that. What a place to end. Let's nail it. Jordan, where can people find you online? Where can people find your work? I feel like we just scratched the surface of Game B and your work. Where can people find you?
Well, I don't really have a public persona per se. I mean, I have a Twitter. I tweet occasionally. I've got a YouTube channel. I used to make videos. I don't do it that much anymore. I used to have a Medium channel. I don't write that. I do have a Substack, but honestly, I don't express that much, to be frank. I'm kind of in operating mode. I'm working on a version of the project that I call the Civium Project, which is just doing it. When something seems worth sharing, I'll express it, usually, frankly, on Twitter or on YouTube. So if you subscribe to those and you care, you might get notifications, although I'm probably down-throttled quite a bit these days. But what I would say is something more like this. Just attune to the things that are most relevant to you. And if anything I say is relevant, it'll probably get to you through the right channels.
All right. Well, you were too humble to mention your Twitter handle. So if you want to follow Jordan on the Bird app, it's jgreenhall, twitter.com/jgreenhall. And I discovered you, I think, on the Rebel Wisdom podcast. So I think that you've done a little bit of work with them, and there's some really great content out there for people who want to dive deeper as well. Jordan, this has been a fascinating conversation. I learned a lot. I think our audience is going to learn a lot and really love this. And so thank you so much for coming on the GreenPill podcast. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I hope that it was helpful. It's always such a hard thing to know. Oftentimes I listen to myself speak at the end and I'm like, holy shit, that was nonsense. But other people seem to sometimes find it helpful. So that's why I keep going on these things. Thank you very much for creating this context, by the way. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity between Game B thinkers, people who've been around the block, and people who are traversing Web3 to create a synthesis between them. So appreciate your step forward in doing that, Jordan.
Beautiful. All right, man.
All right. Peace.